Expanding markets and moving west, manifest destiny. So the question I like to ask you guys with this section is, does manifest destiny violate our American ideals? So think about that. The election of 1844, you have James K. Polk. He's a Democrat. He's one of two presidents born in North Carolina. Of course, he spends his adult life in Tennessee, so he runs from Tennessee. His nickname is Young Hickory because the guy he looked up to was Andrew Jackson, so he models himself, or people think he's very similar to Old Hickory. He has a slogan, 5440 or fight, and that's mainly dealing with the Oregon Territory. We'll talk about how he settles this. He's the only candidate in the 1844 election that really went after and wanted Texas. So he's a believer in manifest destiny. He believed that it's our will to move, it's our, God's will for us to move west. So Henry Clay, running for president yet again, I believe this is number 3 or number 4 for him. He's a Whig. He didn't want Texas. He wanted to avoid a war with Mexico. And then you have Martin Van Buren, former president, and he's of the Liberty Party, and he doesn't want Texas either. So this is a famous picture of manifest destiny. There's a lot of things going on in the picture. See if you can label some of them. So attitudes toward the frontier. You're going to have a reading, or you have had a reading on John L. O'Sullivan. He wrote an article here on the subject of expansion, and he believed it was God's will for us to expand west. There are, however, practical reasons for us to expand west. First off, land. People move west to get land. It's cheap. It's free in some instances with the Homestead Act, but cheap and free land. Expanding the markets to make a profit. There's more opportunities out west because we're expanding there. More space for immigrants and middle class people. Once again, cheap land, and immigrants don't have to worry about being discriminated against and all that good stuff. Number 4, put a star by number 4. It's big. This is the one you really need to know. We want to trade with China. We want to use a western port. We want to use a western port to get to China. That port that we always looked at was one that Mexico really liked and that Mexico owned, and that was San Francisco. Guys, we've wanted to trade with China since before we were a nation. In 1778, Benjamin Franklin sent the King of England during the American Revolution a guarantee of safe passage for expedition going to China, with the caveat, could we get the trade route? Could we get the route? So we have been interested in trading with China. What we do today with China is nothing new. We have been interested in trading with China since before we were a nation. The 5th reason people move out west is to avoid creditors. After the Panic of 1837, people went into debt. People wanted to make a new start. So, of course, they'd move out west, change their name, and they would have a new identity. This was the day before computers and Social Security cards and all of that good stuff. So, trails west. You'll see the Santa Fe Trail leaves from Independence, Missouri, and heads to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Put a star by the Oregon Trail. This is the highway to the west. It leaves Independence, Missouri, and it goes to Portland, Oregon. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman are the first ones to take it in 1836, proving that the trail was passable with wagons. So, one tragedy that you could watch down here on the bottom is the Donner Party. It's a group of 87 people, pioneers. They took a wrong turn in Utah. Instead of going north of the Great Salt Lake, they had information that it was quicker to go south of the Great Salt Lake. However, instead of giving them a week ahead, it put them like a month behind, 3 weeks behind. That comes in critical because they get stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and 41 people died about 6 miles from where they needed to go. I think it's 6 or 60 miles from where they needed to be. They had to resort to cannibalism to survive, and so it's a horrific tale. Anyway, the Mormon migration. Upstate New York, 1827, Joseph Smith, this gentleman here, he receives a message from God. In 1830, he establishes his church in Fayette, New York. He's persecuted, so Him and his followers moved to Commerce, Illinois. They renamed it Nuevo in 1839, which it remains that name today. The Mormons are going to be persecuted there as well for polygamy, that is, marrying more than one lady. Smith is actually killed there in Nuevo. So you get a new leader, Brigham Young, who moves the Mormons farther west in 1847 to the desert by the Great Salt Lake, and they moved to this discreet location so they would not be persecuted. This down here at the bottom is Brigham Young. This right here is his great-grandson, great-great-grandson. I think maybe 3 times great-great. I think it's great-great-great-grandson. He's in the NFL Hall of Fame, and he played at Brigham Young University. He's a lefty, and he was very good athlete, running quarterback. He's Steve Young. So here's the Trail of the Donner Party. If you want to look, this is the way they should have gone to Fort Hall down. They took this track here, and it gets really mountainous over here on the west side of the lake. So resolving territorial disputes in 1844, President Polk's goal was to get all of Oregon. The newspapers adopted the slogan 5440 or fight from Polk's address to Congress. 5440 was the northern part of the boundary in dispute. In 1846, Britain and the U.S. agreed to the boundary settlement, and its current boundary is today between Canada and the U.S. Here's the 5440 boundary. This is what we were calling for. This is the compromise we settled for, which creates the northern boundary of the U.S. to this day. So in other words, we pretty much split the territory in half. One major reason the British didn't really care about this too much is because the beaver fur trade had diminished. The pelt hats and coats had gone out of style. It had been a 350-year in-style thing, but by this time it had gone out of style, so they didn't need the hunting grounds. Expansion into Texas. So Hispanic and Native American populations, if you look here, religion in the West, what happens to the religious network after Mexico wins its independence? The mission system, it goes into decline in the 1820s and 30s, and this has a major impact on Mexico because it's hard to govern those lands with no laws there. And so when the religious network goes into decline, it puts pressure on the Mexican government. The impact of Mexican independence ties with the northern provinces loosen trade with Mexico. So northern provinces and the U.S. grow. So the northern provinces of Mexico start trading with the U.S. more. Mexico finds out, like Spain did, it's hard to govern such a large area. So Mexico starts inviting U.S. settlers in. They win independence in 1821, and they immediately start inviting U.S. settlers into Mexico in the northern parts. 1821, 23, and 24, Mexico offers U.S. agents called espresarios large land grants to help prevent Indian attacks, horse thieves, and border disputes. Americans jump at this chance to own land and flock to the land of Texas, which is Mexican province. So what's going to happen here? Stephen F. Austin, he becomes the most successful espresario in 1825. And they're going to issue, Mexico is going to issue 297 land grants. Okay, this group becomes later known as the Old 300. They actually have a club there today, and they're still known as the Old 300 as descendants of these families. Each family received 177 acres of land for free, and then you had 4,428 acres of land so your cattle could graze. So conflicts over slavery. Mexico closes its borders to U.S. immigration in 1830. They basically walled us out. And they were getting really frustrated with the U.S. Citizens or U.S. immigrants coming in and bringing their slaves. Mexico sends its troops into Texas to police Texas, and they didn't send enough police, so the Anglo population, of course, doubles between 1830 and 1834, and they're not, Americans are not even supposed to be moving into Texas here. You got to keep in mind, Spanish submitted Mexicans to Mexico to slavery, and Mexico won its independence from Spain and fought against slavery. So that's why this was a big deal when they closed the border of Texas off to the U.S., even though our population doubled there. President Santa Anna arrests and imprisons Stephen F. Austin for inciting a revolution. And then you get the Alamo here in 1835. Austin returns to Texas. Santa Anna blames Austin for the Texas Revolution. And as you see, Santa Anna and 4,000 troops go to Texas to force their laws upon the people, anti-slavery. The Anglo troops gathered at a mission called the Alamo, a frontier fort. And as you see here, these people would include Jim Bowie, the inventor of the Bowie knife, Davy Crockett, and they were led by William Travis. The battle was fought from February 22nd to March 6, 1836. And the Mexican military will scale the wall and kill all Anglo soldiers within the fort. So yes, this is where Davy Crockett died. On March 2nd, Texas declared its independence. You get the Lone Star Republic. In March, Santa Anna will execute 445 rebels at Goliad. Sam Houston is the rebel leader, and he has victory at the San Jacinto River, and it's there the rebels would execute 630 Mexican soldiers and capture Santa Anna. After Santa Anna is forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco, it is granted independence. Texas is granted independence. So, in 1836, the Republic of Texas, basically Mexico wants to regain control of Texas, or at least keep Texas independent from the U.S. France and Britain would recognize Texas as an independent nation, and Sam Houston will be elected their first president. So, Sam Houston immediately invites the U.S. to annex Texas. In 1838, the U.S. rejects Texas because of the slavery issue. Texas would enter the Union as a slave state. So, Sam Houston, again, in 1842, asked for Texas to be annexed into the U.S., and this time he's rejected by Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Again, slavery. So in 1844, James K. Polk comes in and says basically, yes, you're going to enter the nation. So they do enter the nation December 29th, 1845 as the 28th state to the nation. So that gets us to the war with Mexico, and we'll pick up with this on part 2.